Hi and welcome to iWizard. Today we're going to be talking about Xenos, Book 1 of the Eisenhorn Trilogy by Dan Abnett. This is my first ever foray into the Warhammer nerddom, the Warhammer 40k universe, and I have a lot to say about it, so let's get into it. All right, Jordan here. Welcome back. We're talking about Xenos, Book 1 of the Eisenhorn Trilogy. Let's get into what this book is about, starting with a little summary I put together for you. In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. The God Emperor's Inquisition moves amongst mankind like an avenging shadow, striking down the enemies of humanity with uncompromising ruthlessness. Our story begins with Gregor Eisenhorn, an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, who has finally caught up with his enemy, the heretic and recidivist Murden Iclone, in the tombs of a bleak planet encased in ice and darkness. Here, Iclone plans the genocide of countless thousands of the ruling elite as they hibernate through the long winter of the planet. But the victory soon turns sour by the death toll it takes. Eisenhorn's longtime partner, the beautiful and courageous Loris Vibben, winds up being one of the casualties, and the awful realization that this man Iclone was merely a cog in a vast interstellar machine, a sinister conspiracy driven by the enemies of the God Emperor. Now Eisenhorn is in a hurry to follow up the trail before it gets cold, and hopefully stop the catastrophic menace before it wreaks havoc and ruin upon humanity. In the process, he uncovers a conspiracy so diabolical that it threatens to unleash the corruption of chaos upon the Imperium. As events unfold and Eisenhorn gathers allies and enemies, he must face down a vast interstellar cabal and the dark power of demons, all racing to recover an arcane text of abominable power, an ancient tome known as the Necrotuk. Alright, so that's just a little bit of a synopsis there, and I have to say it's taken me a while to finally read one of these Warhammer books, mostly because I was always a little bit reluctant to get into a book series that is based on a nerdy RPG tabletop game sort of thing. I myself have never really been a huge tabletop game type of guy. I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. I never have. I've never played Warhammer. I don't even play computer games like World of Warcraft. But I guess one of the things that opened the door for me was reading R.A. Salvatore's Dark Elf Trilogy, which I love. That is one of my favorite fantasy series. And that book is set in the Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons universe. And so once I read that, I started paying attention to other books set in prefabricated worlds, like Zelda and Star Wars and Forgotten Realms and Warhammer. And I found myself wondering, you know, if I liked Dark Elf Trilogy, if that was good, maybe there's something to these books. And I started going into Barnes & Noble, and I started noticing that the Warhammer section, they call it the Black Library, that section was expanding. Every time I would go into Barnes & Noble, that section was getting bigger and bigger, and I couldn't stop from going over to that section and just kind of browsing it and taking a look at it. And one of the things that always stopped me from reading these books is that the covers always have these hulking, chisel-jawed, gigantic, toolish Space Marine type characters with these crazy technologies. This guy's got some blaster strapped onto his shoulder, and I'm like, are these really well written? And to this day, I'm sure that not all of these books are well written. In fact, I've watched people give reviews, and apparently many of them are just crap. But I want to say that Xenos, which came highly recommended to me, Xenos was top-notch. It was a great book. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I read it. One of the things that, because I guess I was intimidated initially by the whole Warhammer universe, and so I wasn't sure where to start, and so I Googled it, and I came upon this Forbes article that basically gave a list of the Warhammer books that you should start with. And what I found consistently as I read different articles is that this Xenos by Dan Abnett really is the place to start if you're looking to get into this universe and not be overwhelmed by it. And I have to say, I'm glad that I started with Xenos. It was truly a well-written sci-fi book. I don't know how good the other books are, but I have to say I really did enjoy this book and I would highly recommend it. All right, so let's get into what I liked and what I didn't like about this book. So what I liked, let's start by talking about the engaging first-person POV. I wanted to start my Warhammer journey with something that wouldn't overwhelm me with lore and world building and details that would alienate me because I have no experience with Warhammer. And so this worked really well. I felt really connected to the characters, and it felt like a really ideal introduction to the 40K world because this is a detective story and it was very character driven. You are on this journey with Gregor Eisenhorn and the story is really personal, but also one of the things that gets you into the plot is that this story is really a police procedural novel. The Inquisitor Eisenhorn is like a really buff, sort of grizzled noir detective trying to solve an intricate puzzle as he goes up against an evil cabal, a network of bad guys and cults. We spend the entire novel with Eisenhorn and his pals unspooling this web of secrets, and that's very satisfying, or at least it was to me. But it really does combine sort of cyber-gothic, hard sci-fi elements with a kind of old-fashioned, grim, world-weary noir detective sensibility. There's a mystery at the heart of this story, and the plot is really well done, really well crafted. There are surprises and twists and turns. There is this stress and release pattern. There's comic relief. It doesn't middle. It gets right to the point, and it really unfolds a well-executed plot that moves along really at the perfect pace. So this definitely gets, for the plot, it gets a 9 out of 10. Speaking of that, I want to say that I really enjoyed the team that Eisenhorn assembles around him in this novel. They're a real ragtag bunch of interesting companions that are each different from one another. They call this typically in fantasy the hunting group of companions archetype. So in this story, you've got the prostitute, the former prostitute Beckwin that Eisenhorn picks up and basically lifts her out of her shitty life. She is intelligent and has special mental capacities of her own, and so she's kind of a neat underdog character trying to start over in life. She's got a complicated past. Another character you have in this that I really enjoyed was the old savant, Uber Amos. Savants in this, in Warhammer 40K, or sages as they're sometimes called, are sort of like mentats from Dune. They pretty much fulfill the same role. And so Eisenhorn's savant, Amos, kind of reminds me of like if you crossed a mentat with someone like Giles from Buffy. He has this expression that he always repeats. He says, "most perturbatory." So I liked him as well. Who else? I liked a lot of the characters. You've got Loink, the astropath. I love the astropaths. Astropaths in 40K are what is known as psychers. They have these extraordinary telepathic abilities. Many people actually have these telepathic abilities in the Warhammer universe, though the astropaths are the ones that have the most abilities there, and they're responsible for carrying out basically all of the superliminal communications that tie the Imperium of Man together and keep everyone in touch. So they're very useful. And so if you're an Inquisitor like Eisenhorn, you get an astropath assigned to you. And I love that Eisenhorn's previous astropath was actually killed trying to decipher a warp cipher. Anyways, being an astropath is very dangerous, and it deteriorates and changes your body. And so he gets this new astropath called Low Ink, and here's a description of him. Greasy implant plugs dotted his shaved skull and lined his forearms like short spines. And so he's this bald-looking creature who plugs cables into himself and can send messages across space, and he's basically a slave to the Inquisition. So there's all sorts of cool stuff like that. Let's see, you have Eisenhorn's chief servitor, a robot named Euclid. That was pretty cool too. And he's even got a right-hand man, his best bud, Midas Betancourt. Midas is a tough, hot-blooded, but super loyal companion. You learn a bit about him in the beginning when Eisenhorn's partner, Loris Vibin, dies. I'm not spoiling anything. Loris Vibin dies in the very beginning of the book, and it turns out that Betancourt was kind of in love with her, so he's in a pretty dark mood throughout most of this novel. Another character I really liked was the eccentric, wealthy, kind of estate merchant and ship captain Maxilla. He was actually the character I think I identified with most for some reason. So the characters in this book, I'm going to give them an 8 out of 10. They could have been better fleshed out, I guess, but it was mostly well done, and I was pretty happy with the kind of group of companions that you're on the along for the ride with. I guess they could have been better fleshed out, but it was mostly well done. Some really cool technologies in this book, concepts, weapons, ideas. You have bionics that allow people to augment their failing body parts and live for a long time. You see that in a lot of sci-fi novels, but it's really well done in this book. I think it's really cool how the big bad guys can program and condition their henchmen, their minions, and put fail-safes in them so that if they're being interrogated and a certain secret is asked about, an artificially induced stroke can be triggered and they will just die on the spot. I thought that was really cool. There's drone messengers that track you down and deliver you messages via your pheromones that can do that. There's a really cool planet in this book called Damask where you have these moving trees that follow the wind, like herds of bulbous livestock. Speaking of cool ideas and scenes and technologies, I loved the scene right after iClone's death when they're doing the autopsy. I won't reveal what happens, but I'll just say that you can't be too careful when you're handling a dead body in the 40K universe, so definitely look out for that. I won't spoil it. I also loved the Ceruthi, these really cool alien creatures that you meet toward the end of the book, and I just thought that they were really uniquely devised. A lot of creativity here in this book, and their civilization, by the way, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but let's just say the Ceruthi are very Lovecraftian in a lot of ways. Something else worth mentioning, I really enjoyed and took to the world building and politics of the Warhammer universe. Since I'm new to Warhammer, I'm not going to be able to give you some big overview of how the world works. I'm not going to be able to give you any big history of the Warhammer 40K universe, but I will say that what I learned is really cool. I learned most of what I did about the universe, not by reading this book, but by looking up the terms that Abnett threw into the story on the Warhammer fandom wiki. And so I'll give you a little bit of background here from the Warhammer fandom wiki. Hopefully this is accurate. It says that although it's not recorded exactly when the human race learned it wasn't alone in the galaxy, nor do we know which alien species it first made contact with, what we know is that the first interstellar civilizations that existed made contact with many alien races, the majority of which are said to have been hostile or incapable of cohabitating with humans. When the first human interstellar civilizations began to collapse around the 25th millennium AD, many suddenly isolated human colonies were set upon by aliens. The scattered outposts of mankind were preyed upon for millennia by various Xenos species, pushing the human race toward near extinction. That is, until the Emperor of Mankind revealed his existence and began his galaxy-spanning Great Crusade to reunite humanity under a single interstellar government, a religious empire, the Imperium. The God Emperor, just so you know, is actually seen in this universe as a real god, and he believed that only in unity, a unity bought at nearly any price, could mankind survive. At its inception, the Imperium of man's core objection was the extermination of all alien life forms that posed any threat to humanity. And so the newborn Imperium perpetrated one act of genocide after another, wiping out many alien species. This even applied to the majority of those human civilizations that had founded cultures where alien and human populations had successfully integrated and lived together in peace. Diplomacy then was rarely tried and was more often offered to other human civilizations encountered in the course of the Great Crusade. And so that is where we flash forward to the 40th millennium, thus the name Warhammer 40k, where the God Emperor's Inquisition basically is running around, burning heretics, persecuting blasphemers. It's kind of funny that you actually end up, one of the ironic things about this universe is that you end up rooting for Eisenhorn and some of the other Inquisitors, even though they're basically fighting for the cause of an evil fascistic empire. And there's nuance too. One of the things I particularly enjoyed about this book is that even within the Emperor's Inquisition, you have many different ideological factions. I actually love this part of the book because you actually get to learn about the different factions that exist even within the Inquisition. They're all working for the same cause, but they have different ideologies and they do it in different ways. It's more complex than this, but to make it really simple, there is a Puritan faction and a radical faction. Eisenhorn, the main character of this book, is of the Puritan faction. They are called the Amalathians, and they believe in basically defending the status quo and the ever unfolding will of the God Emperor, working to purge the galactic community of criminal and malevolent elements. Puritans enforce the traditional station of the Inquisition. They work to purge the galactic community of any criminal or malevolent element, the triumvirate of evil, alien, mutant, and demon, anything that clashes with the pure rule of mankind. The preachings of the Ministorum, the letter of imperial law, the God Emperor himself is subject to a Puritan inquisitor's attention. They are hardline, they are traditional, they are conservative, they are merciless. Change is the greatest enemy, Eisenhorn says. Eisenhorn also says, we believe the God Emperor has a divine plan, and we work to sustain the Imperium in stability until that plan is made known. We are the steadfast spine of the Imperium, its antibodies, fighting disease, insanity, injury, and invasion. And so I just want to say, one of the interesting things about this series is that it's set in this bleak world, this nightmarish, very fascistic society of enforced zealotry, fealty to a long-dying God Emperor, a husk of a being maintained in basically a constant half-life by human sacrifices, just to keep him going as the religious figurehead of humanity's fight for survival over several millennium. We've also established that the Imperium loves itself a compartmentalized series of factions and sub-factions. So one of the just interesting things about this book is you find yourself rooting for the characters that you get to know who have to work in this evil system and uphold this evil system. And while Gregor Eisenhorn is a Puritan, it's interesting, there's an even more rigidly conservative faction in the book. They're called mono-dominants, and they're even more intense, but you don't really get to learn that much about them, at least in this book. There are radicals who believe that any methods are allowable if they accomplish the inquisitorial task. Some embrace and use forbidden resources as weapons, like the warp. Some of them go undercover and break all of the rules that they're supposed to uphold. They will overlook certain heresies if that gets them to their ultimate goal. And so anyways, all of this is just a long-winded way of saying that the world building, the politics, the internal politics of the Inquisition itself, the way everything was laid out and presented was a knock it out of the park home run for me. World building in this book gets a 9.5 out of 10. It was just top notch. Okay, so let's talk about the prose in this book. The prose here was totally solid. This obviously is not a work of high literature. It's not trying to be, you know, the prose isn't Faulknerian, it isn't Dickensian, it isn't Joycean, it isn't meant to be. This was just, I think, a really good balance of down-to-earth, serviceable prose with moments of real sparkle at times, and surprisingly good sci-fi writing. The author is never trying to write beautiful prose or to be overly poetic or verbose, but at his best, Abnett can actually write. He has some impressive sci-fi chops. The dialogue is masterful, the exposition is compact, descriptive, satisfying, and the pacing is economical and well done. It hums. The story moves at a really impressive pace. And so I'll just say that the prose, I think, gets an 8.5 out of 10. All right, so let's talk about some of the things I didn't like. There weren't very many things I didn't like, but I thought I would at least mention a few things. One of the things that I didn't like, and I do think it's minor in the grand scope of things, is that it didn't feel like there were enough limits on what the characters could do, on what could happen in this universe. It's kind of a mixture of science fiction and fantasy. The science doesn't seem to have very many limits. I'm reminded of that Robert Frost quote. Poetry without form and structure is like playing tennis without a net. It did feel like at times Dan Abnett was playing tennis without a net, and that might just be a feature of the Warhammer universe. But again, there aren't very many limits on what the characters can do. They have these mental abilities. One of them is called the will, and you can just speak in a certain way if you're well trained, and other characters have to obey your will. There's astropathy and psychers, and once you get to the end of the novel, there are just so many things that Abnett throws at you in the span of like 90 pages, and you're just like, wait a minute, that's possible too now? I can't give you spoilers on that really, but let's just say things get kind of mind-bendy there at the end, and sometimes I just found myself wondering, you know, what are the rules here? Are there any limits in this world, or is just one of those worlds where anything goes? In terms of the originality of the book, I like to rank each book for originality. Obviously, Abnett is limited here. He's kind of bound by the rules of 40K and its history and the factions and all of that. So this really isn't something that I didn't like so much as, you know, nothing in this story is going to blow your mind in terms of originality. This isn't Alistair Reynolds' big idea sci-fi so much as it is just fun, over-the-top Warhammer cop procedural in space. To the extent that there are any big ideas or really cool technologies or elements, it's just really a well-executed pastiche of the themes, tropes, technologies that you see in other sci-fi books. But again, not really a bad thing. It just is what it is. So for originality, I gave this book 8 out of 10. And so overall, this book gets an 8.6 out of 10. I really, really enjoyed this book. It makes me feel like I might be able to read other Warhammer books. For what it was, I was definitely impressed. Another thing I guess that I'll say before I wrap up the what I didn't like section is just that in books like Warhammer, and again, I get this is baked into the cake here, but I never feel like the characters are fully human. The way they constantly get into these fights, for example, Gregor will just have been totally wrecked in a battle, and he'll just be like a husk of a person, and then Abnett will just quickly explain that Eisenhorn spent the next month undergoing training and healing regiments to get back into perfect shape and to power back up, and then he's doing these psychic exercises to regain the sharpness of his mind, and he's all better. And sometimes it just felt like, and I think this is always the case in the genre of military science fiction, sometimes the characters feel like characters in a video game. They're too hardy and they don't feel truly human. They rarely feel truly embodied enough, nor do they feel really psychologically developed. And lastly, for things I didn't like, and again, I don't know that this is a bad thing. I kind of enjoyed it, but I think it's at least worth mentioning. It's not really anything I didn't like so much as I thought I would mention that this book has many similarities to Dune. Clearly, Dan Abnett has read Dune multiple times and was deeply inspired by it. The savants in this book remind me of the mentats from Dune. When Eisenhorn uses his will, this is basically the equivalent of what they call the voice in Dune. The Guild Synopsis in this book reminds me of the Chome Companies, the Chome Company in Dune in myriad ways. So that could be either a good thing or a derivative thing, depending on the way that you look at it. Midas Becancourt, for example, plays the lyre in this book, similar to how Gurney Halleck plays the balisette in Dune. So there were just so many on the nose similarities to Dune that I felt like at times it was a little derivative in that way. I'll say one last thing that I didn't like, and again, this isn't, I expected this going into this. This wasn't a surprise to me. I was kind of expecting this. People warned me of this. Some of the battle scenes in this book were over the top. People would just get utterly destroyed and then they would end up living. Some guy will basically get his face torn apart or his skull will get bashed in and then later he's fine. And I know some of this is the advanced technology and the medical techniques, but at times I just began to wonder what actually does work to kill a person and what doesn't. People can get tortured using the most excruciating methods in this book, and then they're just kind of fine a little while later. And so, yeah, that's just a few things I didn't like. And again, a lot of the things that I didn't like about this book were things I knew going into it and expected. Overall, a pleasant surprise, 8.6 out of 10. This book was really enjoyable. I had a great time. And if that's what you're looking for, is a good plot, a sort of noir detective story in outer space set in a bleak, dark, cyber gothic universe, you will be pleasantly surprised. You will enjoy this book. So that's going to be it for this review. Please hit subscribe. Please feel free to get in touch with me on Goodreads, Facebook. Feel free to donate on Patreon if you appreciate what I'm doing. And I will see you next time. I'm going to be reviewing Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. So I can't wait to do that with you, and I will see you soon. Happy reading.